Imagine being so completely devoted to a cause that the world could end around you and you would keep fighting. Imagine watching the seasons change in a cold forest, surviving on whatever you could find, firing at shadows, telling yourself every single morning that your side was still winning, that orders were coming, that the silence was temporary. Now imagine that the war you were fighting had been over for 2 full years. The guns had gone quiet across all of Europe. The treaties had been signed. The soldiers had gone home. And you were still out there, alone, in the trees, fighting a war that existed only inside your head. This is not a metaphor. This is not a legend. This happened, in the forests of Poland, after the Second World War had already ended, and the man at the center of it was not crazy. He was, by every measure available to him, doing exactly what a soldier was supposed to do. That distinction is what makes this story impossible to shake. His name was Stanislaw Marchewka, and he was not a German soldier. Not a Japanese holdout in a Pacific jungle, but a Polish resistance fighter loyal to the Soviet-backed underground. A man who had spent the war doing what resistance fighters do, moving through darkness, trusting no one, treating every piece of official information as potential enemy propaganda. He had survived by being suspicious. He had stayed alive by assuming the worst. And when the war ended in May 1945 and the new communist Polish government began issuing announcements that the fighting was over, Marchewka did what his entire wartime experience had trained him to do. He did not believe them. He looked at the new government, saw Soviet influence in every corner of it, and concluded that these announcements were a trap, a psychological operation designed to flush hidden fighters out of the forests and into the arms of the very forces that had spent years trying to kill them. He was wrong, but he was not irrational. And that is the first thing you need to understand about what followed. Poland in 1945 was not a simple place. It had been occupied by Nazi Germany since 1939, and before that, in 1939, it had also been invaded from the east by the Soviet Union under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin to divide the country between them like a carcass. The Polish people had spent the war being ground between 2 totalitarian machines, and when the Germans were finally expelled, what replaced them was not freedom. It was a Soviet-backed communist government installed in Warsaw, one that immediately began arresting members of the non-communist Polish resistance, the very people who had fought the hardest against Nazi occupation. These fighters, known as the cursed soldiers, or in Polish the Żołnierze Wyklęci, were hunted down, imprisoned, tortured, and executed by the new regime. Thousands of them, men who had risked everything to fight for Poland's liberation, were branded enemies of the state the moment the liberation arrived with a Soviet flag attached to it. Into this context, place Stanislaw Marchewka, and ask yourself honestly whether his decision to stay in the forest looks like madness or like wisdom. Marchewka had been operating in the forests of northeastern Poland, near the Białystok region, an area of dense woodland that had sheltered partisan fighters throughout the war. He had a network, a small one, but a network. He had weapons, supplies, cached in locations only he knew, and he had the kind of hypervigilance that years of underground warfare builds into a person at the cellular level. When the war ended, many of his fellow fighters did surrender, did attempt to reintegrate, and some of them were immediately arrested. Some were shot. Some disappeared into the Soviet prison system and were never seen again. Marchewka watched this happen. He drew the only conclusion a man with his history could reasonably draw. The forest was still the safest place to be, and so he stayed. 1945 became 1946, and Marchewka stayed in the forest. 1946 became 1947, and Marchewka was still moving through the trees, still armed, still watching, still waiting for something, anything, that he could trust. What did those years look like from the inside? He would have known hunger, the particular kind of hunger that winter in northeastern Poland delivers. Temperatures dropping well below freezing. Snow burying the landscape, every footprint a potential giveaway to anyone tracking him. He would have moved constantly, never sleeping in the same location twice. Reading the forest the way a city dweller reads a street, knowing which sounds were natural and which were not, which silences meant safety and which meant someone was trying to be quiet nearby. He would have had moments of doubt, almost certainly, moments in the gray pre-dawn when the certainty that had kept him moving started to feel fragile, when the absence of any contact from command, of any courier, of any confirming signal, pressed down on him like a physical weight. And then he would have pushed those thoughts away, because doubt was how you got captured, and discipline was how you survived, and he had survived this long by trusting discipline over doubt. The Polish security forces, the Bezpieczeństwa, knew he was out there. They had been trying to find him since 1945. In a country still raw from occupation and political upheaval, a lone armed fighter in the forest was both a practical threat and a symbolic problem. He represented a refusal to accept the new order, a living ember of the old resistance. And that made him dangerous in a way that went beyond anything he could actually do militarily. The search for Marchewka was not just a police operation, it was an ideological one. And it failed, repeatedly, because Marchewka was extraordinarily good at not being found. He knew the terrain better than any search party. He had spent years learning which farmhouses could be trusted for a meal and which were likely to have an informer inside. He was not surviving by luck. He was surviving by skill, and that skill was the direct product of everything the war had turned him into. The end came in 1947, 2 years after the guns fell silent across Europe, 2 years after the Nazi surrender, 2 years after the parades and the celebrations and the exhausted relief of an entire continent. Marchewka was tracked down and killed in an encounter with security forces, the exact details of which remained murky for decades under the communist government that had no interest in making a hero of him. He was officially described as a bandit, a criminal, a remnant of a fascist underground, which was the standard language the regime used to delegitimize any fighter who had refused to accept Soviet-backed rule. For 40 years, that was the official version. The man in the forest was a bandit. His resistance was not patriotism, it was pathology, and under communism, that version was the only version available to most Poles. It was only after the fall of communism in 1989 that historians began the slow work of recovering the stories of the cursed soldiers, pulling their names out of sealed archives, reconstructing their lives from fragmentary records and the memories of people who had stayed silent for decades out of fear. Marchewka's story emerged as part of this larger reclamation, and what the documents revealed reframed everything. He had not been a bandit. He had been a soldier, a man operating according to a coherent set of beliefs in an environment where those beliefs were entirely reasonable. The tragedy was not that he was irrational. The tragedy was that he was rational in a world that had become irrational around him, a world where the official end of a war meant nothing to the people who had the most reason to distrust official announcements. There is a Japanese soldier named Hiroo Onoda who held out in the Philippine jungle until 1974. Nearly 30 years after Japan's surrender, and his story tends to dominate the cultural conversation about soldiers who refused to believe the war was over. Onoda has become a kind of archetype, a symbol of loyalty taken past the point of reason. But Marchewka predates Onoda by decades, and his situation was in many ways more morally complex. Because the thing Marchewka was refusing to accept was not just defeat but replacement. The substitution of one occupation for another dressed in liberation's clothing. When Onoda finally surrendered, he was received with something approaching respect, because the cause he had been fighting for, while lost, had at least been his country's own. When Marchewka died, he was fighting against the government of his own country, a government installed and maintained by a foreign power, and the question of who was the traitor and who was the patriot was not as simple as the official record pretended. The forests of the Białystok region are quiet now. They have been quiet for a long time. If you walk through them, you would see nothing that marks what happened there. No monument, no plaque, no clearing with a small memorial stone. The silence is complete, but inside that silence is a question that does not resolve neatly. At what point does loyalty become delusion? At what point does persistence become tragedy? Marchewka knew the answer that his training had given him, that you hold your position until you receive orders to the contrary, from a command you trust, and he never received those orders from a command he could trust. Because that command had been destroyed, absorbed, or imprisoned by the very power he was hiding from. He was not waiting for the war to end. He was waiting for a version of peace that never arrived. And in a way, for a man like him, in a country like Poland, in a century like the 20th, that version of peace never did arrive. Not cleanly, not unambiguously, not in a form that a soldier trained to detect deception could accept without reservation. What Stanislaw Marchewka's story ultimately confronts us with is the question of what truth looks like from inside a closed system. He had no outside perspective. He had no news he could trust, no authority whose word carried weight, no frame of reference that had not been constructed by years of underground war. Every piece of information that told him the war was over came from a source he had specific and legitimate reasons to distrust. He was not a man who refused to face reality. He was a man for whom reality had become genuinely unverifiable. And that condition, that epistemological trap, was not something that ended in 1947 when he died in a Polish forest. It is a trap that history sets again and again. for individuals and for nations, for anyone who has spent long enough inside a particular version of the world, that stepping outside, it requires not just courage, but the willingness to admit that everything you survived by believing might have been wrong. Marchewka never made that step. He died before he could, and the forest kept his secret for 40 years, until the country he had refused to betray finally became free enough to say his name out loud.